Hey guys, Thunderbee here. Today, I wanted to talk about the two control schemes in Spark and Zero, their differences, and the oversights that make classic controls far more viable than the standard ones. Before I get into it, I want to say that I'm really having fun with Spark and Zero. The game definitely does have its problems that hopefully get addressed with the next patch, but I overall come from a place of really enjoying the game so far. Having said that, I do think that this disparity in control scheme could not only divide the player base further, but inconvenience people who simply just want to play the game. With that out of the way, let's get into why I think classic controls are broken in Spark and Zero. Before we can get into why I think classic controls are slightly stronger, let's get into what's different about both these control schemes to begin with. The changes across both control schemes include reverse shoulder and trigger buttons used for flight and charging respectively, the rework to how supers and specials are activated, the perception and block overhaul, grab activation, and the changes to transformation activation. While most of these seem like changes in preferences, some of these changes actually have huge implications on the game as a whole. Before I continue, I do want to note that the standard control scheme is actually a bit more modular in the sense that you're able to change what certain buttons do and even what shoulder buttons are able to do. It's not as customizable as I would like it to be, but the option is there for people who want to actually change things up. And while these are personal anecdotes, I do think specials, guards, and grabbing is a lot easier to do in the standard control scheme than it is with the classic one. In fact, for most of the game's lifespan so far, I've been actually using the standard control scheme. So if the standard control scheme is much more customizable and more familiar to the modern player, why would I argue that the classic control scheme is stronger overall? The answer to that also happens to be the most game-defining mechanic in Spark and Zero so far, the super counter. Now, I'm pretty sure if you've been playing this game, you really don't need me to explain how strong Super Counter is or why it's super good. But for those who don't know, it's probably the most important defensive mechanic in the game. It can easily get you out of bad situations and more or less separates good players from bad players at this point in the game. I'd say Super Counter is about as useful as it is hard to do, with it literally being a frame-perfect input. So, naturally, players have been doing their best to find easier ways to do it, and having a direct forward input rather than flicking the stick is about as direct as you can get as far as direct advantages go, something that the modern controls simply doesn't have for super counters. Whilst having better odds at doing super counter is probably enough to switch controls, I think the changes to guard are where things really go into overdrive. As you just saw, you're able to input a super counter while guarding. This is a good way of getting your opponent off of you whilst also taking back the advantage. Whilst moves like Sonic Sway and Super Perception exist, they also require you to stop blocking, which makes you immediately vulnerable to things like projectiles and grabs. Buffering an attack while guarding using standard controls has your character do a throw instead, which can leave you vulnerable. There's a chance this might work if your opponent's block string has no gaps, but many players at this point in the game have worked in using Ki Blast in order to keep their opponents off guard, so throwing out a grab instead is bound to leave you vulnerable. While I don't see anything wrong with the tech itself, I do think it's a little bit unfortunate that this technique is only exclusive to one control scheme. Personally, I'd like the ability to change any of my controls rather than having the standard and classic controls be hard set choices I have to make. Outside of a few hard set differences that I think should be easy to implement as changes, I don't think there's too much difference between these two, and it feels like the inability to change these controls from the classic can feel more arbitrary rather than intentional. Associated tech or not, I feel like the game should have launched with these options, but that's just my take. I'd love to hear what you think down below. Thank you for watching.